The North African desert. For centuries, force has ruled the endless miles of sand. On February the 14th, 1941, the Nazi forces rolled into the city of Tripoli with a mechanized might that would prove to be nearly unstoppable.
The Germans controlled all of North Africa except Egypt. If they could take Egypt and the Suez Canal, they could then advance onto the Persian Gulf and take out the major source of oil for the Allies.
General Erwin Rommel intended to do just that. He became known by a name that terrified his enemies, the Desert Fox.
He soon did such a tremendous job in reversing the war situation in the North African desert that the British themselves attached the moniker the Desert Fox to him. And he got to be a boogeyman, for lack of a better word, for the average British soldier who got to thinking, we can't defeat this guy.
It seemed to be Rommel's war, and victory seemed close. But the desert would soon conjure up an opponent. The fox would soon encounter the magician.
Real blades. I shaved with this one this morning. And if you'll pardon me, I'll just take my medicine.
At the beginning of the Second World War, Jasper Maskelyne was in London performing illusions for which he was renowned.
Don't you make me laugh, I shall cut the tonsils out.
One of the most vivid ones I remember, because it was probably his most famous one, was the razor blades. He always did it with a great deal of panache.
Jasper Maskelyne was one of London's most celebrated performers. His special talent was magic.
This is to tie them all together.
Magic ran back 3 generations. His grandfather, John Neville Maskelyne, started the magic business in 1865 with a friend.
They succeeded in getting to London, and in 1873 took a lease on the Egyptian Hall. And for the next almost 32 years, they had a theatre of magic there. Then it was demolished, and so they moved to St. George's Hall in Langham Place. And there they continued until 1933. In other words, 60 continuous years of magic in London. And that is a record that has been unequaled anywhere else in the world.
But in wartime, the theatres were empty, and the magic had gone out of Jasper Maskelyne's act. Britain faced the menace of the Nazis as they marched across Europe and North Africa. A sense of patriotism and of egotism pulled at Maskelyne. He decided to go to war, if not for his country, then for himself.
He was stuck in a world that was destitute, that was desperate, and there were no great stages. There were no great performance areas for him to work his craft. I think what was driving him was a need to be a participant. He had to belong. He had to have a role. And all he had to contribute was his knowledge of magic.
He had this ability to conceal things when people were looking straight at them. Now, that is the art of camouflage. So his answer was, I think I can get a job in the British Army in their camouflage division.
If I could stand in the focus of powerful footlights and deceive attentive and undisturbed onlookers, separated from me only by the width of the orchestra pit, then I could most certainly devise means of deceiving German observers a mile away or more.
Maskelyne lobbied hard at the War Office, signing forms and answering endless questions, only to be rejected.
Jasper's mission to use his magic to assist in warfare, of course, was not something that readily was understood by recruiting officers. Furthermore, when war broke out that month, Jasper was 37, which was an age bracket which was not immediately being conscripted, and further, he wasn't in the reserve, so here was this man coming along with ideas they were unfamiliar with. And it took him a long time to break down their resistance until eventually he was accepted into the Royal Engineers.
On October the 14th, 1940, Maskelyne arrived at Filey Castle in Surrey to attend a camouflage training school, but he found it tedious. He did not fit in.
He was dealing with men who'd been in the army all their lives, men who believed in tradition and the correct way of doing things, and they couldn't really see that there was anything to be done by a conjurer.
When Maskelyne tried to combine his skills of illusion and deception with the more traditional camouflage techniques of the day, he was greeted with suspicion.
Camouflage was mostly being developed by engineers. While the engineers are great at building things and implementing things, it takes something of a creative person to develop the new ideas to put into play. And Maskelyne really believed, with justification as it turned out, that he was an original thinker that could basically make camouflage do things it had never done before.
Though Maskelyne could not seem to sway his superior officers, he believed he just needed the right audience. When the esteemed Inspector General of the British Armies, Lord Gort, arrived to review the unit's progress, Maskelyne seized the opportunity to impress him. He needed to show them that his magic worked. He planned to hide a machine gun bunker using stage magic.
He played the audience, his Inspector General, just as he plays an audience in a theater. There's the opening, the Inspector General's looking around. There's a suspense. There's the moment of kind of disbelief. And all of a sudden the General is going, I can't see it, but I know it's around here. And whack, this broom handle hits him on the legs.
Lord Gort admitted to being tricked after tripping up on a broomstick handle that posed as the barrel of a machine gun.
And he bought it. At that moment, he bought into the magic.
Impressed by Maskelyne's tricks, Lord Gort signed him up for duty. In late December 1940, he was bound for North Africa. The stage was set for the showdown between the Desert Fox and the Magician.
I believed I could vanish batteries, tanks, warships, even aircraft. I thought that tricks could be played on German commanders.
Maskelyne reached Cairo in the spring of 1941. He tried unsuccessfully to drum up assignments for himself. His superiors believed he should use his magical powers in a more traditional manner to entertain the troops. In return for performing some magic shows, Maskelyne was allowed to form his own unit. The army called it the Camouflage Experimental Section. Maskelyne called it his Magic Gang. He interviewed 400 men, but only a select few would be chosen. Men who were not afraid to cut corners or break regulations to get what they needed.
He pulled together quite a motley crew. There was a cartoonist from Punch, a stained glass window expert, a pottery worker, an electrical engineer, some analytical chemists, and one who I would imagine was very useful to him was a carpenter, together with a designer of stage scenery. These constituted his magic gang.
They were undisciplined, unorthodox, and unwanted by the mainstream military establishment, but the magic gang had guts, glory, and imagination. They set up their headquarters in the Cairo suburb of Abyssinia and were ready for duty. But months went by with no assignment. Finally, a job materialized. German bombers were attacking the Allies' most critical supply point in the Middle East. In desperation, British commandos turned to the magic gang. June 1941. The heat of the Mediterranean sun bore down upon an army of men and machines. This was Britain's chief naval base in the Middle East, and the war brought hundreds of ships to Alexandria Harbour. They were a prime target for the German Luftwaffe. In desperation, the British command decided to put Jasper Maskelyne to work and ordered him to do a vanishing trick to make Alexandria Harbour disappear. While Maskelyne was excited by the challenge, he knew that if he failed, he and his gang would be sent packing. On June the 18th, Maskelyne and his men surveyed the harbour.
They were thinking of the usual ways you camouflage things. Can we paint canvas and put it over the ship? Well, you had hundreds of ships, you had hundreds of buildings, you had several square miles of harbor water. It was impossible. And then something dawned on him that he decided it could be done. He says, fellas, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to move Alexandria Harbor. We're not going to hide it. We're going to move it.
Using mud, canvas and cardboard, hundreds of engineers began working under Maskelyne's direction to build a decoy harbour of dummy warships at what was then known as Mariut Bay. With a shape similar to Alexandria Harbour and just a few miles away, the bay stood a good chance of confusing bomber pilots flying under the cover of darkness. The decoy was built specifically for an audience that would be airborne at about 8,000 feet, though it was smaller in scale than the real harbour. Maskelyne paid special attention to getting the perspective right.
If you think about perspective, again, if you look at the big illusions that you see on stage, or the grand illusions of vanishing an airplane, those have a lot to do with perspective. It all depends on how you look at it. And Jasper knew that. So what he did was he put his mind's eye in the eye of the pilots, and he built on the ground the perspective to give them the image they needed to see.
As a professional conjurer, Maskelyne knew that light and shadow could direct or misdirect the attention of an audience. So he made sure that his set builders lit up the decoy to resemble Alexandria's naval buildings.
They set out a whole line of ground lights. These were all connected up to Ferris Lighthouse, where they could control it from. Also, into the ground were placed explosive charges, which on detonation would simulate the effect of bombs being dropped.
Just 4 days later, on June the 22nd, the stage and its parts were ready at the decoy harbour. At the real harbour, a fleet of newly arrived ships brought on a Luftwaffe onslaught. Maskelyne's magic was about to be put to the test. By order, all the lights in Alexandria were turned off, while in Mariut they were turned on. As the German planes approached, the decoy buildings and ships were blown up via remote control. It was all part of Maskelyne's plan to make the Germans believe they had got the right target and that their flight leader had begun dropping bombs.
The German bombers are coming in a somewhat disorganized way. They're flying at night, which in those days was a very tricky business. The average German bomber will say, one of our people has already dropped their bombs, because he sees lights which look like Alexandria Harbor. He sees bombs going off. What are you going to think? Go for the bombs.
The Germans returned to bomb the fake harbor for 2 more nights. Maskelyne's deception had worked. The war illusionist had found his new stage, and with the success, the magic gang was in business.
It seems utterly, simple and obvious, but nobody else had ever thought of it. He did it and it worked.
Maskelyne's success proved that decoy installations could be used on a far greater scale than had ever been imagined. The principles of light, shadow and dummy structures were used to shelter other British naval bases. Maskelyne's work at Mariute earned him a promotion to major, and something else that had eluded him, the respect of his superiors.
He was basically one of a kind. There was nobody else, in the history of World War II that did camouflage quite the way he did.
The army wanted to see what else Jasper Maskelyne could do. They gave him an even greater challenge, the Suez Canal. The Germans regularly attacked the narrow canal, trying to sink British ships there and make it impassable. The Suez Canal was an important link in the British supply chain. Without this 107-mile-long lifeline between the Mediterranean and Red Seas, British ships on the way to Egypt would be forced to take a huge detour, thousands of miles around Africa's southern coast.
It's those 3 things, Alexandria, Cairo, and the Suez Canal, that Rommel wanted desperately, and Winston Churchill desperately wanted to keep. In fact, he issued an order that we will defend those 3 places to the last man and the last bullet.
When bullets did not work, the army turned to Maskelyne. He was ordered to somehow extend the range of the 90 searchlights placed at anti-aircraft batteries along the waterway, thus making it easier for British gunners to spot the enemy planes. But Maskelyne had a better idea.
Instead of using the searchlights, which were normally used simply to assist the anti-aircraft guns, he basically used the searchlights to blind the pilots. Now, it wasn't just enough to, shine a light in their eyes because they can jink around and they can get out of the searchlight. No, what he did was he turned the searchlights into strobe lights.
Then you would send this dazzling set of beams spinning in the air. In fact, they called it a whirling spray.
Maskelyne planned to hide the Suez Canal in an ocean of light.
The basis for it, which in fact had first been seen on the stage of Maskelyne's theatre in London in 1885, with a technique known as black art, in which a series of lamps facing the audience so that objects behind it are less easily perceived.
Though the secret behind the whirling spray remains classified, photographs show it as an array of reflective glass attached to the searchlight. As it rotated, the mirrors brought havoc to what was once a single shaft of light.
I think I may say, without particular vanity, that the Maskelynes know as much about the deceptive use of mirrors as anyone in the world.
But would it work to save the Suez Canal from German attack? Autumn 1941. Jasper Maskelyne and his magic gang were practicing magic's black art. They made a device that turned standard army-issue searchlights into something much more spectacular and dangerous. They boasted that this magic mirror attachment could protect the Suez Canal from German air attack. Now it was time to prove it. Maskelyne decided that only he could put his device to the test. He climbed into an RAF fighter and rose 15,000 feet over the African desert.
And when they neared the canal, the people on the ground, his Confederates on the ground, turned on the spotlight, and it caused such a dazzling effect that it blinded temporarily the pilot, and they lost cohesion, and they plunged toward Earth, and only in the last 400 yards did they manage to pull up to keep from crashing.
The near-death experience convinced Maskelyne and the army that the device was ready for deployment. 21 searchlights with whirling sprays were set up along the canal. Enemy aircraft failed to penetrate the curtain of light.
Many a Heinkel and Messerschmitt spun down into the earth when hit by that flickering blaze of light.
After the Magic Gang's 2 big successes, there was no shortage of assignments. Their next big job came from the Commander-in-Chief in the Middle East, General Wavell. He wanted to deploy a large number of tanks near Alexandria, but Rommel's land and air spotters were a problem. Could the gang make his tanks invisible to the Desert Fox?
The desert is a particularly difficult place for camouflage deception because it's flat as a billiard table, generally speaking. It's featureless. There's nothing to block the view. And both sides, most of the time, were in plain view of each other.
Maskelyne had to somehow make a tank look like a truck, not only from the air but also from close up on the ground. The camouflage equipment had to be lightweight, easy to set up, and inexpensive to produce. The Magic Gang set to work, hammering and sawing at their headquarters. Within hours, the gang had designed a device they called a sun shield.
It was in fact 2 frameworks that fitted over a tank from front to back and that split down the center and effectively converted the tank into an innocent-looking lorry or truck. And this could be controlled from the turret of the tank beneath by pulling a lever. The 2 sides fell down and the tank rolled out, just effectively a metamorphosis, like a butterfly coming out of the cocoon.
Maskelyne's sun shield created the illusion of a truck, but he realized it would also be necessary to rub out the tank's tracks in the sand. So a spiky chainmail device was attached behind each tank to make its tracks appear to be those of a big truck. Maskelyne positioned the camouflage tank in plain view side by side with several trucks. Neither the officers on the ground nor the pilots circling overhead could spot the tank. Within a few days, General Wavell concentrated what looked like a mass of harmless transport outside Alexandria, opposite an Italian weak point, but it was really a tank strike force. The tanks smashed right through the Italian front line, stopping an enemy offensive into Cairo before it began. Hearing the news, Maskelyne was rightfully jubilant, but not just over Wavell's success.
I danced with joy. War magic was coming into fashion at last, and now I knew that this was only the first small beginning of what we could do.
June the 21st, 1942. Britain's grip on Egypt was slipping away as Rommel and his Africa Corps captured the port city of Tobruk. Rommel, now a field marshal, pushed the British 8th Army back to El Alamein, 60 miles west of Alexandria. As part of a desperate rearguard action, Maskelyne's gang was ordered to create ambushes to confuse and trap the enemy. They prepared an unlikely trap.
Lumps of camel dung or any other dung you can think of, donkeys or horses, to put on roads in parts of German occupied territories. they were constructed of explosive. So a truck would see a lump of dung go bang, and that was the end of one truck.
The ruse, while successful, was far from being the grand illusion that Maskelyne had yearned for since arriving in North Africa, the one that would make the difference between victory and defeat in the desert. That assignment came from British General Bernard Montgomery. He had a plan to beat the Desert Fox on the sandy plains of El Alamein. Montgomery's Operation Lightfoot had to succeed against all the odds.
The British could not afford to lose. And they were the ones who were attacking. They had to get the Germans out of there. They needed a victory for morale purposes. They could not afford to lose their oil. I mean, it could change the outcome of the war, literally. The Germans, for the same reason, it was their only shot to get the oil. The Battle of El Alamein was a decisive battle because it was all or nothing for both sides.
Montgomery decided to launch his attack on El Alamein from the north, where the supply lines were located. But the general's strategy had a twist.
He knew the only way he could win was to make the Germans think that he was going to attack someplace else. So the trick was, how do we fool the Germans into thinking the attack is going to come in the south? And that was Maskelyne's job, and that's what his camouflage was all about.
Maskelyne's grand illusion had to outwit the Desert Fox. In September, with only 1 month before the launch of Operation Lightfoot, he and the gang worked like never before. They knew that the Battle of El Alamein would settle the fate of North Africa.
I think the size and scale of the battle really gave Jasper the stage that he really wanted to have. His heart was singing, but I'm sure he was scared to death.
The biggest drama in which I ever played a humble part was being staged on the grand scale, and villainy was already beginning to know that the final hour of reckoning was at hand.
Maskelyne and his gang created the illusion of an army gathering to the south. Dummies of all sorts were planted there. Tanks, guns, aircraft, men, steel helmets, even a dummy pipeline of flattened fuel cans.
They duplicated the army that Montgomery had in decoys so convincingly that the Germans actually put their main force opposing the decoys instead of opposing the real army.
But Maskelyne had not finished yet. He helped to mastermind the operation's key deception, codenamed Bootram. By means of a simple transposition, a real force of 150,000 men and thousands of tanks and guns would be moved in view of the enemy forces. By October the 6th, 3 weeks before the battle, genuine tanks along with dummies and sunshields were concentrated to the south.
The Germans get used to seeing this or that, what they call furniture of the battlefield, and think nothing of it.
Then, on the nights of October the 18th and 19th, the British concentration of men and equipment switched from south to north.
They would move tanks with their engines muzzled, creep forward, and get under these hulls, so when the Germans saw what appeared to be trucks, they couldn't see the tanks under there.
The Germans had no idea of any troop movements.
Simultaneously, the tanks that had left the south were substituted with dummies made by Maskelyne's gang.
Late in the night on October the 23rd, Montgomery's 8th Army finally attacked as planned in the north.
Rommel was not only taken by total surprise by this enormous subterfuge, by these illusionists, but only had half of his force up there to contain it.
The Desert Fox had been outfoxed by the war illusionist.
Rommel held off for 2 days, committing his reserve to the north when he finally realized he'd been snookered. But it was too late. The German line had been penetrated, the British tanks were on the road, running along the coast.
On November the 4th, the German and Italian lines gave way. Rommel's surviving forces, outnumbered, outgunned, and brilliantly outwitted, retreated to Libya, a defeat partially engineered by a magician. The duel in the desert was over, and the British had their first victory in the war. On November the 11th, 1942, Winston Churchill praised the operation in North Africa, saying, "By a marvelous system of camouflage, complete tactical surprise was achieved in the desert. The enemy suspected, indeed knew, that an attack was impending, but did not know how, when, or where he was to be assaulted." Jasper Maskelyne had completed his last grand illusion in the desert.
He provided that one extra bit of oomph that turned a stalemate into a British victory. It was the first victory of the Brits over the Germans, and you can't underestimate that.
This subterfuge was enormous benefit, saved probably thousands of lives.
The battle for El Alamein was a tremendous physical and psychological victory for the British forces. But Maskelyne's work was not finished. Using war magic developed in North Africa, he used similar wizardry in 16 countries throughout the Middle East and Europe.
It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you the one and only Jasper Maskelyne. You've got a lovely thread for a razor.
In 1946, he returned to England and to his first love, performing.
This is where we drop the chopper again. Isn't this exciting? I love doing it, I do really.
To give you a little idea of how proud he was of his work during the war, he went to the army and got approval for his whole roadshow to be dressed in British Army uniform.
And here is little Birdie in the gilded cage.
And he toured the country very successfully with a good magic show, but variety started to go down as television became more popular, and eventually Jasper had to retire, and he moved to Kenya, where he did a few shows.
Though Maskelyne returned to the conventional stage, it did not end there. A conjurer to the end, Maskelyne began to write the final chapter of his life. But even in his autobiography, he seemed to hide many critical details behind a curtain of smoke and mirrors.
I guess you could assume that being a magician, he respected the magician's code of ethics, and that is never to reveal a secret. But I think there was probably another dynamic at play, and that is Maskelyne, being very, very intelligent, was not only a great illusion designer, but he was also a great PR man. And I think he recognized that, like Houdini before, the less he talked, the more other people would talk.
And they did talk. Even his own son, the first Maskelyne in 4 generations to distance himself from the family business, found it difficult to separate the facts from the fiction surrounding his father's life.
He was his own best promoter, and my father was one of many hundreds, if not thousands, of clever men employed to do clever things in evasion and escape and camouflage.
Maskelyne took the secrets behind his life and work to his grave. He died in Kenya in 1973 without ever revealing his war illusions. They remain a mystery today, classified as top secret by the Official Secrets Act, and will not be made public until 2046. The secrecy surrounding Maskelyne's war magic leaves many to wonder how some of the effects were achieved. The illusion's underlying principles are unchanged since Maskelyne's day. The basic idea for his whirling spray, the device used to protect the Suez Canal from Luftwaffe attacks, is a trick that dates back over 100 years.
It is a method of camouflaging one surface against another, and by creating a light field, he was able to dilate the eyes of the pilots, and in doing so create what's called a black wash, basically making the Suez Canal become invisible.
In California, magician Franz Harare demonstrates how to make a row of tanks disappear using the method of black art practiced by Jasper Maskelyne. Key to the illusion are two portals, each containing over 300 high-power aircraft landing lights.
Where Maskelyne shot all of his lights straight up, I'll be shooting mine straight out at you. By using these light portals, you'll see how the simple manipulation of light can completely change an environment.
The lights are first positioned facing the tanks, so they're easy to see.
But then with a very simple move, more specifically, turning the lights around and shooting them at the audience, you'll see how very quickly your eyes dilate and you lose that sense of depth perception. All right, gentlemen, take your places and prepare to rotate the aircraft landing lights. In 3, 2, 1, make the rotation.
The area behind the portals becomes a black wash, and the tanks appear to have vanished. For Jasper Maskelyne, the beauty of the illusion was always in the eye of the beholder. Whether it was a Nazi bombardier looking down from high above, a field commander tricked in the North African desert, or a fan watching his magic act. Whatever he did, and however he did it, the magician did it with style and with imagination.
Nobody had an inkling of how critical his efforts were. He was a secret weapon, if you want to call it that, for the British, and the Germans never really caught on. The CIA and intelligence people, they know about Maskelyne, and they always worry that the other side will have one.
As a performer myself, I understand that really what it's all for is entertainment. But Maskelyne took it to another level. Maskelyne actually applied his art form to save lives. And how do you put a value on that? That's real magic.